Hello, welcome to this dad and daughter debate on the subject of change in the church. My name is Chris, I'm a Methodist minister in the Methodist Church of Great Britain, and this is my daughter.
Christiana, and I've had roles in the Methodist Church in Britain as youth president a long time ago, and in the World Methodist Council as the chair of the Youth and Young Adult Committee up until a couple of years ago.
So that's kind of who we are, but we're not speaking for the Methodist Church. This is more our private and personal views about change and the church generally. Just over a few minutes of thinking, and we'll perhaps share some of our own views and also debate some of that depending on where the conversation goes. So Christiana, do we need change in the church, do you think?
Yes. Yeah, we do need change in the church, I think. It's difficult to know how much change, because how much do you change so that you reach people and you're accessible to people, but without sort of changing the key integrity and that kind of thing. So yeah, definitely yes, but how much I'm not sure about.
Well, what about if change is the only way of keeping the key integrity?
Well, yes, definitely then. And I think that's really important to think about, because obviously society changes and people's understanding changes. So it's definitely something that in the church we should always have a view to. How are we staying relevant and serving people in society and the community? And if change is the way to do that, then that's really important, I would say.
See, I wonder if one of the things I've been struggling with more and more as the years have gone by is the way that churches inevitably become institutions. And institutions nearly always fall into the trap of perpetuating themselves as a priority rather than their essential purpose, or at least that's a trap and a risk. And sometimes we consume vast amounts of energy trying to prop up the institutions around us, whether that's church or something else. And what that actually does is stifle the institution in a strange sort of way. The protection of the institution kind of stifles it. So I'm wondering whether the time has come for more radical change in the institutions around us, including the church.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with that. I think one of the things you find when working within a church is that there are sometimes big frustrations with how long it takes to make decisions and put things into action, and that's usually for the reason, or for a very important reason, that you're trying to make sure that you're doing the right thing and not rushing into something that's kind of ill-advised or not of God. But on the flip side, sometimes it's frustrating. It feels, and also I think you sometimes can move so slowly that you almost feel like by the time you get to that change, it's no longer relevant. So I do think, yeah, sometimes the institution almost becomes such an important sort of entity in its own right that we forget sometimes what's the point, like why are we here, what are we doing. We're not just an organisation, but actually, we're supposed to be this living, breathing community, and how we do that and how we action that without just getting bogged down in red tape and that kind of thing.
So there's a real tension here, isn't there, between does one work for evolutionary change, that gentle incremental change, or does one work for revolutionary change, which is much more drastic, which can do with huge shifts in the way things happen and in the direction of things, and which of those is best and which is right for which sort of time as well? How would you say you would judge the time for revolutionary change? Because I guess people are always trying to evolve things, or there are always some people trying to do that. When do you say that's enough, this isn't working, we need something more radical? Have you got a way of judging that at all?
Well, no. The problem is that a lot of the time when you well, I don't know. My experience, I guess, especially as a young person in the church, which I'm not really anymore, but that's like a lot of my experience, has been that young people a lot of the time really want radical change, and it's something that doesn't feel like it happens very often. So it's, I don't know, I feel like you spend a lot of time as a young Christian or young person in the church kind of wanting this radical change that you think is going to be really beneficial, and fighting for it, but then people fight, like pushing against it. So I don't know, because I think that you can make the argument for revolutionary change a lot of the time, but it's how you achieve that actually, because it's not really enough just to have a few people or even a large amount of people often who want that, because sometimes the institution has become so big and powerful that it's very difficult to action that change. And so, yeah, it's a tricky one really, because sometimes I think revolutionary change is the best thing, but then how do you achieve that? How do you manage it? Especially because a lot of the time you have a lot of people that don't want change anyway, especially not a big revolutionary change. Some people don't even like it when it's small and incremental. So I think it's really tricky to know when and how you do that, and also I suppose it depends on what you're talking about, because sometimes an issue just becomes very timely and actually society is talking about it, and so that makes it easier within the church because like the tide is moving that way anyway. But other times that might not be the case. So I guess it's also being aware of what's going on outside the church. It's not just what we're doing, it's what's going on at a wider level in society, because sometimes I think that revolutionary change happens when there's kind of a bigger push from more people, I suppose.
Yes, I'm sure you need a groundswell of support with revolutionary change. The difficult thing about revolutionary change is obviously it's often out of step with those that hold decision-making responsibilities or hold power or authority in organisations, and that's where there's quite often conflict and it's very uncomfortable. I guess the context that you talk about, what's going on in society and so on, can be quite important, but that can be a complication in itself, can't it, as well? Because the church is called to be countercultural.
Yeah.
So just because the world around us is doing it doesn't necessarily make it right. So although that can be a guide, it can also be a confusion as well. I do wonder as well whether within the church sometimes our structures militate against necessary change happening quickly. Within many church organisations and structures, not all by any means, but within many of them, there's a kind of democracy at work. And I'm all for that, I'm not against that at all. But the trouble with democracy is often you find you end up taking a middle way. I'm not against that either. In fact, usually I'd say let's take the middle way. But the problem is if you've got a large group of people and you're in a bit of a crisis situation, for instance, probably just carrying on tinkering around the edges isn't going to get you very far. And yet you're likely to just tinker around the edges, because if you've got a group of people and it's democracy, much of the time what you do is you have people on one wing saying one extreme thing, people on the other wing saying we don't want anything to change, and so you end up somewhere in the middle, which is fine if things are going well and you're fulfilling your purpose and your vision and all the rest of it. But if you're not, simply choosing the middle way, which in effect probably means very slow evolutionary change, probably just perpetuates the problem. So I find myself in a dilemma there. What can you do? Because the system itself prevents people from doing anything other than going with the system. Bit of a conundrum from my point of view.
Yeah, it is difficult, actually. I think that's one of the tricky things. And actually, although on the flip side, I think one of the really good things about Methodism, one of the things I like about it, is that you can have people within it who have widely differing views, and that the tension there and how we kind of explore that and still stay together as a church and a community, that's a challenge I think is really good for our community and for our community in general. But like you say, the problem that you have then is if something requires a revolutionary or a big change, then it can be a hindrance to that. But I suppose it's tricky. It's tricky as well because we're talking very hypothetically, and we're not really talking about a kind of a specific change at the moment. So I feel like we're talking in sort of very generalized terms. So I wonder if there's anything, like any kind of particular areas that we should discuss more kind of specifically, like are we talking about like the way that the church is structured, for example, or like what, like is there something we kind of delve in like just a little bit deeper so that we can sort of, I don't know, explore the idea in a more
I suppose if I was going to pick a specific area, I'd pick the area of mission and evangelism, because generally speaking, the church in this country has been in decline for quite a while now. Yes. And yet mission, evangelism, going and making disciples of all nations is our core purpose. And I guess you'd say that very largely in this country, most of the church is failing to do that. Not all by any means. There are signs of growth in different denominations and groups of churches and individual churches, but as a whole, we seem to be part of a Western picture of decline. So I would say you can't change things by doing the same thing. Well, that's unusual. That's unlikely.
Yes.
So I don't know if that's one area.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. A good topic to explore. I do wonder though that maybe sometimes, like with this example, that we are almost forced into, working kind of towards a revolution of how we do things because what we're doing isn't working, and actually sometimes that is the thing that pushes us, because if what we're doing isn't working, then like you say, if we keep doing it, then eventually we're not going to get anywhere. The church is going to die out. Although, I mean, maybe just one particular church, maybe another one will grow up, take its place, and maybe that's the idea, is that actually that's when you need to be thinking in the revolutionary way and saying, like, why are certain types of church, why are certain areas of the church sort of dying or declining, and is that because actually that type of church is no longer relevant to society, it doesn't fit into society in the same way that it used to. And actually, as we talk about this kind of Western idea, well, a lot of the places where the church is growing, society there looks very different than it does in the Western world, or in Britain if we're looking at our own context. So we can't copy that because that's the model that works in their context. But actually we live in a context, we don't have an example that we can follow and say, oh, this society went through this and they decided to do whatever, change church, and this has worked. So we're kind of going blind, I guess. Which, yeah, I mean, it's exciting, I think, can be, but at the same time, yeah, it's tricky because you kind of think, well, why, we know that for some people the church is a really important part of the community, but we also know that it doesn't have the same standing in society that it once had in this country. It's not kind of central in the same way, and so that's why it's so important for us to think, what do we offer, what can we offer, and yeah, so I think revolutionary thinking in that context is really important, because if we carry on, then, well, the church won't be there much longer.
It sounds to me a little bit like you're saying individual churches or types of church or groups of churches may have a shelf life or a best before date. Not the church, but individual ones.
Maybe I hadn't really thought of it like that.
Which is quite a challenge to us, isn't it? So remember, if you want, you can post comments at the bottom of this and tell us what your view is in this knotty problem of, is it evolutionary change or revolutionary change in the life of the church? So this has been a dad and daughter debate.